They thought she was just another quiet woman renting stalls on the south end of the property, someone who kept to herself, paid early, and spent more time with horses than people. But the day the old field line rang, every assumption in that stable died in the span of 10 seconds. If you agree that respect is earned in silence long before the world notices, make sure to like and subscribe, because what happened that morning was not just a call. It was a revelation clawing its way out of hiding. But before that ringing ripped through the air, there was something else no one in that place knew. Something that had been quietly waiting to surface like a buried flare under ash. Years ago, when Claire Arden's name still came with a prefix spoken in briefing rooms and war zones, there'd been a sealed envelope tucked into a personal effects crate, stamped with a recall clause most soldiers prayed they'd never hear invoked. Nobody at the Maple Run stables knew that. Of course, to them she was just Claire, 28, polite, quiet, always arriving before sunrise like she belonged to the morning itself. The rumor among the teenagers who worked weekend shifts was that she'd grown up on a ranch or maybe had a trust fund somewhere. Because how else does someone that young lease 4 horses and a private tack room without flinching at the cost? The adults didn't ask, partly because she never caused trouble and partly because she had the kind of presence that hinted questions would bounce off her like pebbles against steel. Still, there were signs if anyone had looked closely. The way she tied knots, firm, economical, not the kind you learn from Pinterest tutorials. The posture she defaulted to when standing still, weight balanced, head angled toward doorways, listening without appearing to. The scars across her knuckles, faded but not forgotten by the body that made them. The kids joked she could probably disarm a mugger with a curry comb, and they meant it as flattery, not prophecy. But nobody gave it thought until the morning the air itself seemed to hold its breath. The sky had only just shaken off the last threads of fog, leaving the fields damp and smelling faintly of rain. Claire had been working a young bay mare named Harlow, whose temperament was 80% patience and 20% wildfire. She'd slipped the bridle off and was running a brush down the mare's neck when it happened. At the far end of the barn, next to a storage alcove most people forgot existed, an olive-drab field telephone, mounted years ago as some novelty relic from the stable's founder, crackled to life with a shrill, cold ring. Not the polite digital chirp of a cell phone, not the muted buzz of the office landline. This was sharp, metallic, unmistakably military, like something that shouldn't still be wired to anything in this century. For a heartbeat, everyone froze. Kelsey, the 14-year-old who shoveled most of the manure and never stopped talking, stood stock still with a broom in her hands. Mr. Callum, the owner, blinked twice like he'd just heard his own name shouted across continents. One of the boarders, an accountant named Morgan, actually dropped a bucket of oats. The phone rang again, harder somehow, as if distance was vibrating through the line. That was when Claire paused, but only for a breath. Her hand, still resting gently against the mare's withers, went still in a way that wasn't fear, more like recognition, like a soldier turning toward the echo of a familiar command. She didn't look at the others, didn't speak. She simply handed the brush to the stunned teenager nearest her and stepped away from Harlow with the kind of slow, precise calm that only comes from walking toward things most people would run from. Her boots made soft, deliberate sounds across the straw-laced aisle, and with every step the barn seemed to grow quieter, like even the horses understood the shift. The phone rang a third time, the sound cutting through the dust and birdsong with a certainty that felt older than any of them. Claire reached the alcove and lifted the receiver without hesitation, and in that moment, half the stable staff realized they knew absolutely nothing about the woman they'd been working beside for nearly a year. Nobody could hear what the voice on the line said, only the static and something like the low hum of engines far away, but they heard her reply clearly because the barn was so quiet that even breath had gone still. "Lieutenant Arden, reporting," she said, calm, steady, not whispered or dramatic, just factual, like those words had been waiting behind her teeth this entire time. Someone near the feed room actually gasped. The teams traded wide-eyed glances that bordered on awe and disbelief. The older ranch hands exchanged looks of uncomfortable recognition, as if a secret had just stepped into daylight wearing combat boots. Claire listened a moment longer, jaw tense but eyes strangely peaceful, then said, "Acknowledged. I'll depart immediately." When she set the receiver back into its cradle, The silence didn't break so much as settle, thick and electric. She didn't make an announcement, didn't turn with some dramatic flourish, didn't explain. She just walked back toward Harlow, removed her gloves with practiced efficiency, and told the nearest hand to cool the mare down and check her left fetlock before turnout. They nodded without thinking, still processing the words Lieutenant Arden like a foreign language they should have known. As she headed toward the locker room, a few of the boarders whispered theories: National Guard, ROTC, some family inheritance of rank. But none of them could reconcile the way she'd answered that phone with anything short of active service. And the truth was, buried in classified files and sealed orders, she'd never fully left. Her recall clause had been buried in paperwork and dusty archives, the kind of thing most soldiers aged out of before they ever heard the word again. But war has a way of remembering names long after the world forgets to ask about them. By the time Claire reached her truck, the stable hands had collected near the paddock fence, stunned and silent, watching her with a respect they didn't yet understand. And as the dust stirred under her tires and the old field phone sat quiet as bone, one thing became certain in a way nobody could ignore. The quiet woman in stall 12 hadn't been hiding from a past. She'd simply been waiting for it to call. The drive from Maple Run to the airfield on the outskirts of Briarton should have taken 40 minutes. But Claire made it in 32 without ever crossing the speed limit, her focus so absolute it bent time around her. The sky was still dragging itself fully into daylight, a pale wash of gold over the hills, and the world around her felt like it hadn't yet caught up to whatever forces had stirred her name from the past. At the stables, speculation had already splintered in every direction. Kelsey swore she'd seen something sewn inside Claire's duffel once that looked like a unit patch, but she couldn't remember the details. Mr. Callum went back to his office and stared at the dusty rotary phone mounted by the fuse box, trying to recall if anyone had ever confirmed that the old field line was still active or if its connection had been severed decades ago when his father ran the place. No one swept the aisles. No one resumed feeding the geldings or checking tack. Even the horses seemed unsettled, shifting and snorting like the air retained whatever frequency had powered that call. But Claire left them behind with the ease of someone who long ago learned how to pack away one world for another. Her truck, an aging silver Tacoma with mud-caked tires and a cracked dash, held everything she needed in a single reinforced rucksack stashed beneath the back seat. She hadn't touched the bag in over a year, but she pulled it free with one hand, unzipped it just enough to check the essentials, then set it on the passenger side without ceremony. The highway unfurled ahead of her, quiet and open, giving her too much space to think and not enough time to outrun memory. She remembered the last recall rumor, for years earlier, when whispers circled her old unit about reactivation after a diplomatic collapse overseas. It never came to pass, at least not for her. She'd been honorably released, reassigned to reserve status with a rare clause that most assumed was clerical debris left over from a mission they didn't have clearance to mention. But someone, somewhere, still had her number, and that someone had just woken her past like a blade unsheathed in a dark room. At the airfield, the guard at the gate looked up from his checkpoint station and blinked twice as she rolled down her window. There were soldiers who aged out of their bearing, lost it in office jobs, marriages, suburbia, but Claire carried hers in the set of her shoulders, in the way she met his gaze without challenge or apology, in the subdued authority that made him stand even before she spoke. He asked for ID. She gave him a laminated card most people assumed didn't exist anymore. He made a call, murmured into the receiver, then waved her through with a stiffness that betrayed both confusion and respect. The tarmac beyond the chain-link fence simmered with early activity. Transport trucks reversing with cargo, uniformed personnel moving like a living grid, a helicopter idling near a hangar with its blades throttling the air in lazy revolutions. She parked beside a row of unmarked vehicles and stepped out without hesitation, shouldering the rucksack like an extension of her spine. Memories came not as flashbacks, but as muscle tension, breath patterns, heat along old scars. A man in fatigues with captain's bars approached at a jog, his expression a mix of relief and disbelief. "Lieutenant Arden," he said, and for a half-second his voice held the echo of their last deployment. Dust storms, radio chatter, nights where sleep felt like a rumor. He told her the briefing would start in 10 minutes, That command wanted her in conference too. That half the people in the room didn't know she existed, and the other half thought she'd vanished into civilian life for good. She asked only one question. Operational parameters? He handed her a sealed folder with a red band and clearance stamps that belonged to government branches most people would never hear named out loud. As they walked toward the hangar, conversations paused in quiet ripples wherever. She passed. Some recognized her. Others recognized the way silence moved with her. And somewhere, beneath the thrum of rotors and the bark of distant orders, Claire felt the old world settling around her shoulders again, not as a weight, but as a promise that whatever they were calling her back for hadn't ended when she walked away. It had only been waiting. They didn't gather to watch her leave, not because they didn't care, but because none of them knew how to stand in the presence of something they were only just beginning to understand. Her truck rolled out quietly, no dust spray, no engine roar, just the steady hum of departure from a life that had only ever been temporary, though none of them knew that until the phone rang. At first, no one moved. The horses shifted in their stalls, tails flicking, ears twitching like they sensed the absence before the humans did. The bay mare, Harlow, stomped once and exhaled in a long, restless huff, as if she already missed the hands that had gentled her that morning. Work tried to resume, but routine felt like walking through someone else's house in the dark. Kelsey swept the aisle twice without remembering the first pass. Another stable hand forgot to latch a gate and had to circle back, cheeks burning with embarrassment he couldn't explain. Even the boarders, people who usually kept their distance, found themselves lingering by her stall, glancing at the empty hooks and neatly coiled lead ropes like they might offer context. Mr. Callum eventually wandered back to the alcove where the field phone hung. He'd always assumed it was some relic from his father's era, stripped of wires decades ago, and left as a bit of rural military nostalgia. Now he stood in front of it and couldn't decide if he was uneasy or awed. The phone was silent, its purpose fulfilled in a single, jarring moment. He brushed a thumb along the metal, noticing details he'd ignored his whole life. Maintenance screws, a service stamp, a cable that disappeared behind the wall instead of ending in dust. By midday, the question started, quiet and careful at first. Was she really military? Why would they keep a line like that active? What kind of recall brings someone back without warning? No one had answers, but the speculation never turned gossipy. It wasn't mockery or scandal that filled the space. It was recalibration, the slow rearranging of everything they thought they knew about the woman who cleaned her own tack and never forgot a horse's injury history. Evening chores brought a strange reverence. Someone set out her feed pails, even though she wouldn't be there to fill them. Another hand checked Harlow twice, brushing her with the same strokes they'd seen Claire use, mimicking a rhythm carved into memory by repetition. It wasn't imitation so much as respect taking physical form. When the sun dipped low and shadows stretched across the paddocks, the conversation softened into what-ifs and almosts. Maybe she'd been in the reserves. Maybe she'd been special operations. Maybe she wasn't supposed to be here as long as she was in the first place. But beneath every theory was the same realization none of them wanted to admit out loud. She hadn't been hiding. She'd simply been waiting for the world that owned part of her to call her back. The days that followed didn't erase her absence, but they reshaped it. Nobody touched her stall or her tack room. The teens stopped calling her that horse girl and started referring to her as Arden, without knowing why that felt more fitting. Mr. Callum told the staff to leave the field phone exactly where it was. Don't disconnect it. Don't move it. Don't cover it up. Not because he expected it to ring again, but because now it meant something, even if that something remained unspoken. And somewhere between dawn feedings and evening turnouts, the shock faded into quiet admiration, the kind that doesn't need ceremony or headlines, the kind that lives in the space between what people witness and what they choose to carry forward. She had walked among them not as a mystery to be solved, but as a chapter they were never meant to read entirely. And whether she returned or disappeared into the life she'd never really left, they all knew this much. Claire Arden had not stepped out of their world. She'd simply been called back to the one that still needed her.